They are saying goodbye to a friend and a neighbor, and a fellow brother in Christ and congregant. So, this private service at Maranatha Baptist Church is probably going to be more intimate than what we saw at the National Cathedral, though I think the service at the National Cathedral, with all of its pomp and circumstance, was actually pretty intimate. And then the family is going to have an opportunity to commune with their patriarch and to be able to say goodbye before they inter him. And he's going to be buried under a willow tree on the property of his house next to Rosalind Carter. This was a site that they chose together. And so I think it's a fitting end to the boy from Plains returning home and then being next to his beloved wife of 77 years.
Well, and it was incredible to hear in one of the eulogies from his grandson, Andra, him talking about how every Sunday when Jimmy Carter would get up to teach Sunday school, he would kind of survey the room, and it was people from all walks of life, from all parts of the country, who would come there to be with him during his Sunday school and his services at that church. And it does kind of bring to the fore, of course, the deep faith that Jimmy Carter had, how he was still such a normal human being in many ways, and it gave many people the opportunity to have very up close and personal experiences with him, even as he was a former president. And I know you shared some of those yourself. Can you just shed some light on who Jimmy Carter was to you?
Yeah, so, I had a couple of interactions with Jimmy Carter because of his affiliation with Emory University. So, when the Carter Center began, its offices were first on Emory's campus. They still maintain ties between Emory University and the Carter Center. And President Carter was a tenured professor on the faculty. So he didn't teach regular classes, but he would engage faculty, invite them out to lunch. He would also offer to, or more or less tell you that he would teach your class. And so he chose classes, I guess, that kind of fit his interest and where he might have things to share. And so in those interactions, students got to interact with him. So, I'll never forget the day that he came and taught my class. And it's an African-American politics class. So he told us about the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, which was a piece of legislation that the Congressional Black Caucus sponsored in the 1970s to try to get full employment for African-Americans. And he talked about why that bill didn't actually achieve the goals that it wanted to. And that's something that I still repeat to my students today and will continue to do so. I'm also struck by the connection between the Carter Center and local universities. So I know that I've had at least one student who was able to go on an election observation trip with the Carters while they were doing their work promoting democracy around the world. And that's not to talk about the countless students from Atlanta area schools who interned at the Carter Center and all of the public programming, some of which actually involved being able to meet the Carters directly. So they were very accessible, very humble people. And I think their humility allowed us to be able to relate to them and also to be able to sit and learn from them. They invested in people. And that's been very, very clear this week as you talk to employees at the Carter Center and people who've had the pleasure and the honor of being able to interact with both President and Mrs. Carter.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story, Andra. We were struck by the optics in 2021. Pretty historic moment in retrospect when the Bidens went to visit the Carters at their home in Plains, Georgia, where the family is, of course, now headed. This iconic photograph that we're showing on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube together in the Carters' living room. What was their real relationship, Joe Biden and Jimmy Carter? We've heard so much about the early endorsement. We've heard so much about the parallels between their administrations. What did they think of each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, this picture, I think, shows the warmth of that relationship. And President Biden certainly talked about it in his eulogy. So this is, a professional relationship that extends more than 50 years. And as, one of the standard bearers of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden is certainly somebody who would have called upon Jimmy Carter for advice. And President Carter would sometimes emerge at points to try to provide, guidance and support to be the elder statesman. He certainly didn't shy away from expressing his opinion. I'm sure President Biden, remembers the time that when he was vice president, President Carter came out and spoke very forcefully about some of the opposition to President Obama and openly questioned whether or not it was racially motivated. And I think for some, he was saying the quiet part out loud. And because he was a former president and because he was a white Southerner of a certain age, he was able to say things that other people couldn't say. And I think that was very important and that was very impactful. What President Biden said today, I think, was an exhortation to all of us to remember that personal integrity matters, that selflessness matters, and that those can be harnessed for civic good. And President Carter certainly embodied that, not just in his political life as governor and as president of the United States, but also in his post-presidency. He is the model of what a global citizen is, but what a civic-minded person is.
Well, we're watching now live on Bloomberg TV and YouTube the motorcade arriving at Joint Base Andrews. Again, what is usually Air Force One, the 747, is waiting to take the remains of President Jimmy Carter and his family back to Georgia after the services here in Washington today as we see the motorcade rolling through. Andra, you were just speaking to a very important point, which is that Jimmy Carter rose to political prominence as a Southern white man who was vocally for integration, not segregation, who obviously had strong feelings about racial equity in the United States. Can you just speak to a moment for that legacy when we think back to the political where the political environment was when he first was entering public service?
I think it's important to point out that there's an evolution in terms of Jimmy Carter's advocacy for racial issues. He was certainly taught by his mother to treat blacks with respect. His parents owned land. They had tenant farmers who were African American. And so most of the people that he grew up around on his family farm were African Americans. And they had a tremendous impact on his life in terms of who his biggest influences were as a young man. But yet he was still a white man of the greatest generation in the South. And so he had all of the privilege that came along with it. And he didn't necessarily sacrifice those privileges as a teenager or as a young man. And in particular, after his father died and he took over the family business, he was actually really reticent to be a vocal advocate of civil rights because there would be ramifications for his business. And as he started to move into politics, there would also be ramifications for his political viability. He ran for governor unsuccessfully, didn't get the Democratic nomination in 1966. Lester Maddox, the segregationist, ended up winning the nomination and the governorship. And so in 1970, when he was running to succeed Maddox, who was term limited, he pandered to folks who were still holding on to segregation. He's reported to have told blacks, "You're not going to like how I campaign, but you'll love how I govern." Some people could argue that that's not sort of a shining moment of integrity. But when he got elected governor of Georgia, he announced that the days of supporting segregation were over and it was time for Georgia to move forward. And so that thrust him into the national spotlight as being a new kind of Southern governor who was going to turn from the ways of the George Wallaces of the world and kind of move towards the path of integration. So we start to see in the 1970s him talking more about civil rights, of him not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk in terms of his gubernatorial appointments. That's something he continues as president of the United States, appointing more women and people of color to positions of power than his predecessors did. We see it in the decision of him to sever ties with his family's church, the one that he had attended for years because of their refusal to integrate. We also see it in terms of the stances that he took. One of the places where you could argue that he had a moral failing was, in the during this period where he was a businessman, there was a Christian communal integrated community that was set up nearby that everybody else in town shunned. And the Carters were privately nice to these people, but they didn't necessarily stick their necks out publicly. It is at this commune, if you will, that you see the genesis of Habitat for Humanity. So there were members of this community who were instrumental in founding Habitat for Humanity. I think there's a case to be made that President and Mrs. Carter's advocacy for Habitat for Humanity in their post-presidency was in some ways compensation for not actually having defended them publicly in a forceful way that it would have been warranted to do in the 1960s.
Yeah.